On the Question of Sikh Identity. By Arvind-Pal Mandair. The early European accounts of the Sikhs can be divided into two distinct strands, Orientalist and Anglicist. These two strands paint somewhat opposing portraits of the Sikhs, and their system in relation to the Hindus, the term given to other non-Muslims in India, who were regarded by Europeans as polytheists, pantheists, or simply heathens. The earlier strand can be regarded as Orientalist and depicts Sikhs as deists, a term which served to differentiate them from the Hindus. The later Anglicist strand refuted the Orientalist accounts, and tried to present the Sikhs as mere Hindus. The two terms can be broadly defined as follows. Orientalist is a representation of Oriental cultures, by scholars and administrators and travel writers, whose belief system was broadly deist, the idea that there is a God, and that all humans are born with reason, but since creating the world, this God has moved away from it, leaving mankind to run itself through recourse to reason. Deism prepared the ground for secularism to emerge in the 17th and 18th centuries. Orientalists had sympathy for indigenous forms of knowledge and languages, which they equated with European languages, and they wanted to help natives bring about renaissance of their cultures, etc. Anglicists are those whose belief system was drawn from a more evangelical strain of Christianity. They argued that indigenous cultures and their learning needed to be completely replaced by English, and the natives anglicized, to produce Indians in color but English in customs and manners. What is interesting about these two strands, is that it reflects important fault lines running through European culture at the time. These fault lines were themselves indicators of political and intellectual battles between European intellectuals and policy makers over the meaning of concepts such as freedom, religion, and secular, and whether such concepts could be applied to non-Western cultures. Orientalist depictions of the Sikhs include short sketches by travel writers such as Henri Polier, 1783, George Forster, 1785, and James Brown, 1785, and a longer essay by the noted Indologist, Charles Wilkins, 1788. These accounts were primarily ethnographic in nature, and commissioned either by Indian nobles or by Warren Hastings, then director of the East India Company. Wilkins speaks of the relative independence of the Sikhs, that their manners and customs were very unlike the other inhabitants of Hindustan, and that their rise to power during the last decades of the 18th century, was due to the democratic elements in Sikh society, an observation that attests to the prevalence of the Khalsa form, in the missals. Charles Wilkins presented the Sikhs as a third distinct community in North India, a sect of people who are distinguished from the worshippers of Brahm, and the followers of Muhammad, by the appellation, Sikh. The next opportunity for the British to closely observe the Sikhs, fell to Colonel John Malcolm in the first decade of the 19th century, at a time when they had become firmly established as a military power, under Maharaja Ranjit Singh. Funded by the East India Company, Malcolm's reconnaissance mission for them in the Punjab, was published in 1812, as a short monograph, Sketch of the Sikhs. For 3 decades, it provided the only substantial introduction available, until the publication of J.D. Cunningham's History of the Sikhs in 1848, which coincided with the fall of the Sikh kingdom and its annexation by the British. Though more thoroughly researched than previous works, Cunningham's history was not acceptable to the British administration, as it continued to present the Sikhs as an independent people, different from Hindus and Muslims. More suited to the imperialist British sentiment, were Anglicist accounts of Sikhs by missionaries such as William Ward, and scholars such as James Mill, and H. H. Wilson. These accounts argued, that it was erroneous to regard Sikhs as a religion, that Sikhs were mere Hindus, an unenlightened people. Although British attitudes towards the Sikhs betrayed a rising tone of hostility and arrogance in the aftermath of the Anglo-Sikh Wars, fortunately for the defeated Sikhs, such sentiment did not convert into official policy on the ground. In fact, the Sikhs initially benefited from British rule. A board of administration was set up under the direction of the Lawrence brothers, and around 56 highly experienced English civil servants were drafted in from all over India to help govern Punjab. Recognizing the cultural diversity of the Punjab region, where Hindus and Muslims greatly outnumbered the Sikhs, the board maintained a strict policy of non-interference, or what amounted to secular governance, in regard to religious and cultural matters. This policy worked smoothly in regard to matters pertaining to the public sphere, such as economics, the military, transportation, communications and law, but not so well in regard to indigenous culture, which came under the private sphere. The Khalsa army was disbanded and Punjab demilitarized. Those who had served in the Sikh armies were required to publicly surrender their weapons, and return to agriculture or other pursuits. Those who held revenue-free lands, the Jagirdars, were allowed to decline, particularly those seen as rebels. Those Sikhs considered loyal to the British cause, for example Sikh aristocrats, especially those who had noted family lineages or were descended from the early Sikh gurus, were given patronage and pensions. Groups such as the Udasis, who had maintained the historical Gurdwaras during the 18th and early 19th centuries, were allowed to retain proprietary control over lands and Gurdwara buildings. The administration went to considerable lengths to insert such loyalists into the Golden Temple, in order to exert as much control over the Sikh body politic as possible. One reason for this was the emergence of Sikh revivalist groups, such as the Nirankaris and the Namdharis, shortly after annexation. This revivalism was spurred by a growing disaffection within the ranks of ordinary Sikhs, about the perceived decline of proper Sikh practices. The Nirankari group was founded by Dayal Das, who condemned the growing idol worship, obeisance to living gurus, and influence of Brahmanic ritual that had crept into the Sikh panth. He urged Sikhs to return their focus to a formless divine, Nirankar, and described himself as a Nirankari. Dayal Das was ostracized for his strict teachings by upper caste Sikhs, and had to shift his residence several times. His work was continued by various successors into the 20th century, and eventually gathered a following of several thousands. However, they remained a fringe sect, and when they eventually reverted to treating their leaders as living gurus, they came into conflict with mainstream Sikhs, especially in the late 1970s. The other revivalist group, the Namdharis founded by Baba Ram Singh, had more of a social impact due to the fact that they emphasized Khalsa identity, and the authority of the Guru Granth Sahib. One of their idiosyncratic practices, was the loud and almost frenzied repetition of Nam, hence the designation Namdhari, which culminates in a frenzied howling or shrieking, kook of the name. Because of this practice, this sect also became known as kookers, literally, howlers. Many of Ram Singh's followers subscribed to an apocryphal text, the Saw Sakhi, which foretold the decline of foreign rule, and a return to Sikh rule. The British kept the Namdharis under surveillance, particularly at the time of the Indian Mutiny, when Hindus and Muslims had rebelled against British rule. Thus when Ram Singh sent a circular to his followers, asking them to congregate in 1857 at Amritsar, this was considered sufficiently threatening by the administration to intern him. By the 1860s his following had grown to over 100,000 despite his internment. British suspicions about Sikh loyalty largely subsided after the Indian Mutiny of 1857, when Sikh regiments showed loyalty to the British Empire. As a result, the remainder of the Khalsa armies were absorbed into the British Indian Army. In the 1860s, the Punjab administration introduced land reforms to increase agricultural production and land revenues. Large irrigation projects were started, creating the so-called canal colonies which prospered. As production increased, so did the volume of trade. Initially the Sikh peasantry gained from this prosperity. However, colonial rule was also marked by economic exploitation, as most of the agricultural produce was geared towards export needs, which in turn were controlled by British banks and trading companies. The commercialization of agriculture also facilitated the growth of money lending, which was mostly in the hands of Hindu Khatris, who charged high interest rates to peasant landholders. Between the commercial interests of the colonizer and the indigenous money lenders, the peasantry was squeezed, and by the 1880s had again become seriously disaffected. In regard to matters that concern the cultural and social aspirations of the colonized, the results of the British policy of non-interference were complex to say the least. While the British portrayed their governance as resolutely secular and balanced in its approach towards the different religions of Punjab, they were seen by Indians as fundamentally Christian. The reason for this perception is not difficult to ascertain. It lies in the manifest change in the British administration's understanding of secular governance, that took place over a period of almost 70 years from the 1770s to the 1840s. In the early years of colonial encounter, British Indologists in the pay of the East India Company, had constructed India as a land of many religions often in conflict with one another, even though at first, Indian indigenous elites neither accepted nor reciprocated the term religion. During this period, the British administration's notion of secularism reflected policy in the British metropole, where state and religion had a harmonious relationship. Accordingly, in India, the British took over direct responsibility for the administration and upkeep of Hindu temples and rituals, thereby creating a direct relationship between secular British rule and the Hindu religion. However, this partnership came under strong protest from politically influential Christian lobbies in Britain, who demanded that Britain should be either neutral towards native Hindu, Muslim, Sikh institutions, or at least should support the Christian missionary project in India, something which the East India Company had been opposed to. By the late 1840s though, once the British had established direct rule over India, and with policy making driven by politicians of a more evangelical bent of mind, the British administration gave a carte blanche for Christian missionaries to enter India's public domain, while continuing to maintain an outward policy of non-interference or secularism. What justified this double stance for the administration was a combination of scholarly and political rhetoric, according to which India had many religions, but these religions had fallen from their original state of vigor and purity. This fall into superstition and irrationality was the direct cause of Hindus' loss of freedom, first to Muslims, and then to Europeans. To regain their freedom, so the rhetoric went, Indians needed to be civilized according to British customs and morals. They needed, in other words, to be reformed, either through the influence of Christianity, or the secular British state. Missionary activity had already begun during the last years of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's rule, with the establishment of the American Presbyterian Mission in Ludhiana, although it found few converts at that time. This changed immediately after annexation, as important missionary groups, such as the Church Missionary Society, Methodists, Episcopalians, the Salvation Army, and some Roman Catholic orders, set up centers and mission schools throughout Punjab, with the active support of British officials in India, and with substantial financial backing from the metropole. Their most important conversion was that of Maharaja Dalip Singh, the youngest son of Ranjit Singh, and heir apparent to the Sikh kingdom. A spate of conversions of other aristocratic Sikh families in the 1860s caused shock and consternation throughout the Sikh community. The difficulties for indigenous communities were compounded by the administration's policy on education. This policy put into operation the dictates of Macaulay's 1835 Minute on Indian Education by, on the one hand, delegitimizing indigenous education and forms of knowledge and languages, and on the other hand, actively promoting the teaching of secular English literature in all government-sponsored schools, also known as Anglo-vernacular schools, which had been set up throughout North India. The purpose of these schools was to provide Indian native elites with a form of education that would help create a class of Indians, whose mindset was more pliable, so that it could break willingly with indigenous systems of education and become useful to the empire. Given that most of the teachers in these Anglo-vernacular schools were missionaries, and since the teaching of English literature simply relocated cultural values of the colonizer, from overt Christian dogma into the supposedly neutral medium of literature, language, and history, the natives remained suspicious of British policy. Nevertheless, between the 1850s and the 1880s, there was high demand for English education as a gateway to much coveted government jobs. Although the administration's secular education policy made considerable inroads into the Sikh, Hindu and Muslim communities, the natives were not entirely fooled by the show of impartiality. Instead, each of these communities reacted by taking part in an alternative public sphere that was beginning to emerge. This development was exemplified by the emergence of voluntary Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim organizations. Cities such as Calcutta in the 1820s, and Benares in the 1840s, had already witnessed such a development, with the formation of voluntary reformist societies such as the modernist Brahmo Samaj, and the more conservative Hindu Dharma Sabhas. The institutionalization of Hindustani language, which continued to be written in Persian Arabic script, and Hindi, henceforth written in Devanagari script used for Sanskrit, as two autonomous linguistic entities, came about with the founding of Fort William College in Calcutta in 1800, for the purpose of training young British civilians. With Gilchrist driving the college's policy on language, the task of teaching the newly created Hindi was given to a Gujarati Brahmin, Lalu Jahal, who was hired to teach it to the native Hindus in the Devanagari script. A similar service was performed for Hindustani, later known as Urdu, by a Muslim from Delhi, Mir M9. Despite the composition of a number of texts in Hindustani and Hindi by the early 1800s, it wasn't the natives themselves, but the missionaries who solidified the use of Hindi as the language of the Hindus, through the composition and propagation of extensive missionary literature in Hindi, and the implementation of the first printing presses in India in South Asian languages. The following example is commonly cited, to illustrate the discrepancy between official British declaration and desire, for a rectified Hindi to become the standard vernacular, and the actual state of native speech, especially in Benares, the traditional heartland of Orthodox Hinduism. In 1846, almost 5 decades after the founding of institutions such as the Oriental Seminary and Fort William College, when James Ballantyne, the newly appointed principal of Benares Sanskrit College, asked the students to use the newly created Hindi in their written exercises, he found the results to be very poorly executed, with students showing no enthusiasm for rectifying the everyday use of language. Several students formulated reasons for this apparent disregard toward correction. We don't clearly understand what you Europeans mean by the term Hindi. If the purity of Hindi is to consist in the exclusion of Muslim words, we shall require to study Persian and Arabic, in order to ascertain which of the words we are in the habit of using every day, is Arabic or Persian, and which is Hindi. What you call Hindi will eventually merge in some future modification of the Urdu, nor do we see any great cause of regret in this prospect. Far from being dissuaded by these protests, however, Ballantyne argued that the task of forming the national language, of retrieving the true identity of the Hindu's mother tongue, couldn't be left to peasants. It remained the duty of the religious orthodox elites of Benares, to endeavor to get rid of the unprofitable diversity of provincial dialects, by creating a standard literature, in which one uniform system of grammar and orthography should be followed. The Pandits of Benares, if they valued the fame of their city, ought to strive to make the dialect of the holy city, the standard for all India, by writing books which should attract the attention and form the style of all their countrymen. Ballantyne's remarks turned out to be almost prophetic, as a new generation of native elites educated during the 1850s to 1870s, in Anglo-vernacular institutions such as Benares Sanskrit College, took on this task with great zeal. Exposed to English language through the Anglo-vernacular school, these new native elites were instrumental in politicizing Hindi as an autonomous national language of the Hindus, by purging their lived heterolingual experience of the foreign effects of Islam and Persian Arabic. To propagate Hindi as the national language of the Hindus, it was necessary to enunciate, a one of Hindi, Hindi as one, and the Hindus as the subject of the enunciation, I am Hindu, in which the previously disparate, I of enunciation and I of existence, were unified. Brahmanic authority and Orientalism supported each other. Brahmanic hegemony de-Orientalized Brahmins and Orientalized India's non-Brahmanic communities. Brahmanism informed Orientalism that created a written canon to substitute diverse oral traditions in Hinduism. The Bhagavad Gita became canonical. The Gita was first translated into English in 1785 by Charles Wilkins. Wilkins suggests in his preface that the Brahmins esteem this work to contain all the grand mysteries of their religion, and so careful are they to conceal it from the knowledge of those of a different persuasion. Wilkins' remarks are also suggestive of the complicity of interests between the Brahmanical Pandits and the liberal British ruler in this enterprise. An Aryan and Vedic past was manufactured to underline the idea of declining Hindu society, and to blame Muslims for invading India and destroying Indian civilization. Thus, Orientalist discourse helped to essentialize Hindu ideology as the foundation of India. The wisdom of India and Hindu Brahmanism became the true treasures of the Indian nation. Sheldon Pollock says, British colonialism and Orientalism had created Indian history and society that was traditionalized and Sanskritized. British Orientalists, with the help of Hindu informants emphasizing the hegemony of Brahmanic texts, created an Indian history, and the widely accepted view of the contemporary Indian society. Elitist Brahmanism proclaimed itself as the true representation of Indianness and Hinduism. The fact, however, is that the Vedic literature and other sanctioned texts of Hinduism are unfamiliar to many Hindus. Many so-called Hindu and non-Hindu groups ignore or interpret concepts such as karma and dharma differently. Broadly speaking, there were two different kinds of Hindu public response to colonial modernity: reformist and traditionalist. The earliest and best-known example of the reformist Hindu public response is the work of Ram Mohan Roy, 1772-1883, the father of the Bengal Renaissance, and his organization, the Brahmo Samaj. Born into a wealthy Brahmin family, Ram Mohan Roy was unlike other Indians. Wealthy and privately educated in English, he came into close contact with British officers and administrators during the last decade of the 18th century, and the first decades of the 19th century. Strongly influenced on the one hand by early Orientalist literature on India and Hinduism, and on the other by English and American Unitarianism, Roy founded the Brahmo Samaj, which propagated a deist and universalist religion based on certain Hindu sources, notably the Veda and specifically the Upanishads, and the Vedanta commentaries, which Orientalists had invested with the status of the central theology of Hinduism. In various publications and through his own newspaper, Sambad Kaumudi, Roy tried to formulate a rational Hinduism that could become the basis of a universal religion, and therefore as a perfect example of a natural religion, whose basis was not God, but a notion of reason shared by all men. Roy was, however, careful to establish his views by isolating certain textual sources as exclusively authoritative, e.g., Veda as opposed to Purana, and by shifting interpretive authority away from living gurus, toward one's own private, rational judgment. It was therefore a secular humanistic Hinduism, insofar as it was available to all men, and was beyond the religious, racial, and sectarian divisions that characterized other religions in their concrete particularity, including popular devotional Hinduism. Reflecting this point of view, Roy's politics was centered around establishing a version of Hinduism shorn of priesthood, ritual, caste, superstition, and idolatry. The presence and activities of the Brahmo Samaj were not limited to Bengal. Branches of the Brahmo Samaj were set up throughout North India, as Bengali officials moved with the British Empire into Benares, and eventually into the northwest provinces. By the 1860s, branches of the Brahmo Samaj had been established at Lahore, Rawalpindi, Amritsar, Shimla, and Dera Ghazi Khan, among other places. In Punjab during the 1870s, this process was catalyzed by the visit of the Hindu preacher, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, who published an influential polemicizing work, Satyartha Prakash. Dayanand directly countered the Christian missionaries by reinterpreting Hindu doctrine, refracting them through a Christian lens, thereby mimicking and adapting Christian frameworks in such a way that Hindus could claim that they possessed a monotheistic conception of God, a divinely revealed text, the Veda, and that they were descended from a pure original race, the Aryans. Moreover, Dayanand could claim a more ancient lineage for Hindu doctrine, since the language of the Vedas, Sanskrit, was proven by Indologists to be older and purer than any of the European languages. And by arguing against caste and idol worship as later accretions, he neutralized one of the main weapons of Christian missionaries. Initially Dayanand was welcomed by some Sikhs who found his monotheistic and anti-caste stance appealing. But this admiration was short-lived, as Dayanand made harsh and disparaging comments about Guru Nanak. Sikhs soon realized that Dayanand and the organization he had created in Punjab, the Arya Samaj, was an even greater threat to them than Christianity, as it was part of a massive and rising Hindu consciousness throughout India, which tended to regard Sikhs and Sikhi as a minor sect of Hinduism. Feeling threatened, Sikh leaders convened meetings in Amritsar to oppose Dayanand's influence. These meetings culminated in the founding of a body called the Sri Guru Singh Sabha in 1873. This association marks the beginning of the most important voluntary body in Sikh history, a body that evolved into a movement, whose success was premised on an engagement with the British state, and with modernity per se. It is through the agency of this modernizing movement, the Singh Sabha, that the path of Sikhi originated by the Sikh Gurus, also known as the Sikh Panth, was further concretized into a religion that came to be known as Sikhism. The first Singh Sabha, the Sri Guru Singh Sabha, was founded in 1873 in Amritsar, as a response to several different problems which faced the Sikhs at the time. The leaders of the Singh Sabha identified three main threats. From Christian missionaries who continued to gain converts from within the Sikh community. The reverse proselytizing of the Arya Samaj, and their campaign of purification, Shuddhi, which was part of the rising tide of Hindu nationalist consciousness that was fomenting in India, and which claimed Sikhs as a Hindu sect. And finally, the possibility of losing British patronage due to the actions of the Namdharis. The Amritsar Singh Sabha was set up and backed by conservative Sikhs belonging to the Khatri caste, many of whom were descendants of the early Sikh gurus. They included men such as Baba Kame Singh Bedi, a direct descendant of Guru Nanak, Tarkar Singh Sandanwalia, after Singh Vaharia, and Gyani Gyan Singh, a noted Sikh scholar of the time. The conservatism of this Amritsar-based group stemmed from the fact that they saw the Sikh Panth as one among the myriad streams constituting Sanatana Dharma, the so-called eternal tradition, that identifies its source of authority as the Veda. These self-styled Sanatan Sikhs can be traced to those groups that refused to take Khalsa initiation, on the grounds that the Amrit ceremony polluted their ritual boundaries, and threatened their caste status, which they regarded as primary. Though they resented the democratic tendency within the Khalsa groups, they continued to coexist within the broader Sikh Panth, even as they remained aloof from the mainstream Khalsa practices. Never relinquishing their claim to be natural leaders of the Panth, they regained their social prominence in the 18th and 19th centuries, by taking over the main Gurdwaras and other institutions, vacated by the Khalsa Sikhs, in their fight for survival against the Mughal state in the 18th century. Doctrinally, the Sanatan Sikhs considered Guru Nanak to be an incarnation of the Hindu deity Vishnu, and thereby aligned Sikh traditions with the Brahmanical social structure and caste ideology. Thus the predominant concern of the conservative Sanatan Sikhs was to protect the kind of social framework in which they had been nurtured. For these groups, the principle of authority in Sikh tradition was invested in living gurus, as Baba Kame Singh Bedi liked to be regarded, for example, rather than the principle of Shabad Guru, or Guru Granth Guru Panth, as upheld by the dominant Khalsa tradition. The conservative ideology of the Amritsar Singh Sabha invited stiff opposition within the Panth. This came primarily from Sikhs who had strongly upheld the core Khalsa ideals, and had benefited from Western education and employment in such a way, that they were in a position to challenge the traditionalist elites, represented by Kame Singh Bedi, after Singh Vaharia, and Tarkar Singh Sandanwalia. They styled themselves as Tat Khalsa, or advocates of the authentic Khalsa ideals, after the Tat Khalsa of the 18th century. These Tat Khalsa Sikhs, led by men such as Gurmukh Singh, Harsha Singh Arora, Jawahir Singh, and Gyani Dit Singh, became increasingly vocal in their opposition to the Sanatan Sikhs, and formed another branch of the Singh Sabha in Lahore in 1879. Following the lead of the Lahore Singh Sabha, many other Sabhas were formed throughout Punjab. By 1899, there were Singh Sabhas in every town and in many villages. Each of these associations modeled themselves either on the Lahore or Amritsar model. However, the Lahore Singh Sabha proved to be far more successful than its rival, to the extent that the term Singh Sabha eventually became synonymous with the Lahore group, which was the dominant force in the modernization of the Sikh tradition. By the beginning of the 20th century, the two bodies eventually merged into one, the Chief Khalsa Diwan, CKD, partly due to the need for greater political coordination, in the face of a more powerful common adversary, namely, the Arya Samaj, as the main representative of political Hinduism in Punjab. Indeed, the nature of the Singh Sabha's activities, and the character of its modernizing zeal, cannot be properly understood, without acknowledging that it was primarily, if not entirely, a response to the transformation of the term Hindu, from its original connotation as non-Muslim inhabitants of India, to the master signifier of a specifically religious identity, embodied by the entity Hinduism. What made this transformation threatening for the Sikhs, was that it provided Hindus with a form of identification, not only at the provincial level, where they already outnumbered Sikhs, but at the pan-continental level, effectively making India synonymous with Hindu and Hinduism, with the connotation that Sikhs were a tiny sect within a broader pan-Hinduism. The Arya Samaj's systematic campaigns to reclaim Sikhs as reformed Hindus, was evidence of this. Although indigenous use of the term Hindu by Hindus themselves can be traced to well before the 15th century, its usage is derived from Persian Muslim influences, and was primarily indicative of a distinction between people who were native and people who were foreign. Specifically, the word Hindu is a Perso-Arabic variant on the Sanskrit term Sindhu, which referred to those people who lived near the river Indus in northwest India. The Arabic derivative of Sindhu is Al-Hind, which refers to the people of the Indus region. Although these broad connotations were never discarded, by the beginning of the 19th century, the term Hindu had accrued strongly religious connotations that had been developed under Orientalist influences. By the late 19th century, through the interactions between Orientalists, native elite scholars, and missionaries, the term Hindu had become a master signifier of a specifically religious identity. Accordingly, the Singh Sabha's main activities focused on reviving an authentic Sikh consciousness, on the Tat Khalsa model. Much of their activity took place over a period of about 50 years, between the 1870s and 1920s. In the early phase between the 1870s and late 1890s, the collective energies of some of the key reformist figures, such as Gurmukh Singh, Gyani Dit Singh, Mohan Singh Vaid, Bhagat Lakshman Singh, Gyani Harzara Singh, Khan Singh Nabha, and Bhaivir Singh, were focused on redefining popular rituals and practices, and distinguishing Sikh from Hindu or Muslim practices, and redefining an authentic Sikh praxis based on the Khalsa initiation and codes of conduct. And secondly, setting up schools and colleges in towns and villages. Through the creative use of print media, including tract publications and newspapers such as Gurmukhi Akhbar in Punjabi, and the Khalsa in English, these new leaders of the Singh Sabha were able to evolve a general consensus about the authentic nature of Sikh identity. They all agreed that the source of authentic Sikhi was the early Sikh tradition, specifically the period of the Sikh gurus and immediately after. This tradition was embodied in authoritative Sikh literatures such as the Adi Granth, the compositions of Guru Gobind Singh in the Dasam Granth, the works of Bhai Gur Das, selected Janam Sakhis, the Gurbalas literature, and the Rayat Namas. Practices deemed un-Sikh included the worship of idols, the worship of superstitious cults such as Sakhi Sarvar, Gugga Pir and Hindu deities, their incarnations, marriage ceremonies conducted according to Vedic rites, and officiated by a Brahmin. Authentic Sikh practice meant receiving Khalsa initiation, the adoption of the 5 Ks, and the name Singh or Kaur. More importantly, Sikh rites of birth, death, and especially marriage, came to acquire great importance. Sikh parents were encouraged to send their children to Khalsa schools, where the teaching of Punjabi and Gurmukhi was compulsory. Having been educated in Anglo-vernacular mission schools, the Singh Sabha reformers were aware, however, that the success of such an extensive program of social reform depended on their ability to create a systematic corpus of literature that could provide doctrinal and historical elements necessary to persuade an increasingly literate Sikh populace. Central to this endeavor was the ability to interpret the meaning of Sikh scripture. True, there already existed a tradition of scriptural exegesis. However, a great deal of this material had been produced in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, by scholars belonging to the Nirmala, Udasi, and Gyani schools, whose interpretation was strongly influenced by Brahmanical philosophy, that helped to sustain the conservative culture of the Sanatan Sikhs. The Nirmala and Udasi schools had risen to prominence primarily because of the Khalsa's preoccupation with the quest for political power, in the last decades of the 18th and early 19th centuries. Udasi and Nirmala scholars were routinely patronized by Sanatan Sikhs, the Sikh nobility, or were employed as granthis at Gurdwaras. From the Singh Sabha perspective, the Udasis and Nirmalas interpreted Sikh scripture from within a Brahmanic framework, making it easy for the Arya Samarjists to claim Sikhi as a reformed Hindu sect. Thus the efforts to renew the understanding of Sikh scripture, and to recapture the original spirit of the Sikh Guru's teaching, became a cornerstone of their mission. This effort was conceived as a long-term project, whose outcome would be the publication of a detailed series of commentaries on Sikh scripture. Closer attention to some of these publications suggests that the exegetical project was motivated mainly as a reaction to the new era, in which the representation of Sikh teachings through English had assumed a crucial importance. For the Sikhs, this new era proved to be a rude awakening, since their tradition had remained intrinsically connected to its Punjabi homeland, and there was never any strong incentive in earlier centuries to disturb the close association of scripture with liturgy, by encouraging translations of the Adi Granth. But by the late 1870s, for the first time, Sikhs were forced to come face to face with the dangers as well as the possibilities of translation, where the stakes were nothing less than a displacement of indigenous categories, in relation to Western or Anglophone categories. One event in particular marked this new era of conceptual encounter with the West. This was the commissioning of an official translation of the Adi Granth by the British administration in Punjab, and its eventual publication in 1877, by the German Indologist Ernest Trump. Trump's translation can be considered as an event of cultural translation, in the sense that it continues to cast a shadow on all modern translations and representations of Sikh scripture. For this reason alone, it merits some brief attention. Trump's basic thesis was that although the chief point in Nanak's doctrine was the unity of the Supreme Being, there were no reasonable grounds for differentiating the notion of God in the Adi Granth from orthodox Hindu philosophy. Clearly influenced by the Brahmanical leanings of his Nirmala collaborators, Trump translated the first line of the Adi Granth, by missing out the numeral 1, rendering the terms, ik oankar, by the syllable, orm. Since Hindu philosophers had long expounded the meaning of orm, as signifying the pantheistic unity of the Hindu deities, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, it suggested that Nanak's notion of God was pantheistic, hence unable to transcend multiplicity and achieve a sufficiently monotheistic conception of divinity. Trump, in other words, designated the Adi Granth as lacking theological transcendence, and lacking systematic unity. Trump's thesis did several things at once. First, it suggested that the previous British accounts of Sikh doctrine, written by men who had no training in the language of the Sikh scripture, as a moralizing deism, were mistaken. Secondly, that Guru Nanak's teaching was essentially Hindu in its orientation, and thirdly, that Sikhism could not be considered a proper religion, as it did not have a sufficiently exalted idea of God. It could not prove the existence of God, and if it couldn't do this, there was no basis for any ethics, and no possibility for the Sikhs to form some kind of self-government. As in the case of the Hindus, the evidence of their own scripture justified the colonization of Sikhs by a European power. Fourthly, it shifted the conceptual terminology for representing Sikh scripture and its teachings into the domain of Western philosophical theology. It provided a conceptual framework that future translators could contest but not ignore, nor could they remain unaffected by it. In order to refute him, it was necessary first to immerse oneself in, and adopt the premises of Western Christian thought. Trump's thesis had the potential to undermine the administration's established view of the Sikhs as a distinct community, with its own system of ethics and self-governance, a view that was strongly echoed by the Singh Sabha. As such, it presented their leading scholars with a clearly defined task, to prove that their scripture could yield a sufficiently exalted concept of God, and a system of ethics. This task was incorporated into the long-term project of formulating new exegetical commentaries on Sikh scripture. One of the first commentaries to be commissioned from within the Sikh community was by the Raja of Faridkot, Bikram Singh. Its main writer was the Sanatan Sikh, Bhadan Singh, whose work was published as late as 1905, in 2 volumes known as the Faridkot Tika. This work, however, had already been superseded by far more accessible interpretations by the Tat Khalsa intellectuals, such as Khan Singh Nabha, Bhaveer Singh, and Principal Teja Singh. In the 1890s, Khan Singh Nabha published 2 important works, Gurmat Prabharkar and Gurmat Sudarkar, which contained a listing of key teachings by the Sikh gurus, arranged in alphabetical order, and supported by relevant quotations. In 1898, Nabha published his influential tract on Sikh identity, Hum Hindu Nahin, We Are Not Hindus. This was written in response to Sanatanists, who had published a tract entitled, Sikh Hindu Hain, Sikhs Are Hindus. Also at around this time, Bhaveer Singh, by far the most important literary figure in the Singh Sabha movement, had begun to publish a series of influential novels that recreated the heroic age of the Khalsa, in the 18th century. Novels such as Sundri, B.J. Singh, Satwant Kaur, and Baba Naud Singh, helped to introduce the genre of historical fiction into Sikh and Punjabi literature. Although the Singh Sabha scholars wrote and published mainly in their native Punjabi language, there were some important collaborations with British Indologists that led to publications in English. The most important of these was the 6-volume study of Sikh history and scripture, by Max Arthur McAuliffe, published in 1909 by the Clarendon Press. Unlike Trump, McAuliffe opted to disperse translated hymns from Sikh scripture, within traditional narratives of the lives of the Sikh gurus. Working closely with Khan Singh Nabha and other Sikh Gyanis in the 1890s, McAuliffe's expressed aim was to controvert Trump's main charge, that Sikhi was a mere pantheism, and to reinstall it within the history of religions as an indigenous monotheism of India. But as McAuliffe himself admitted, even though his narrative faithfully mirrored the views of his Sikh reformist collaborators, the conceptual terminology of his critique of Trump was ultimately conditioned by the very schema used by his predecessor. No one, wrote McAuliffe, has succeeded in logically dissociating theism from pantheism, thereby suggesting that the moment when Sikh scripture is translated into a European language, must coexist in a terrain where all talk of religion or of God is automatically rooted through categories of Christian philosophical theology. Thus the only difference between McAuliffe and Trump's translations was the position that each attributed to Sikhism in the evolution of religions, which for McAuliffe was a fully fledged theism, and for Trump a pantheism, or a moral atheism. McAuliffe's translation helped the reformists to satisfy their desire denied by Trump, to prove a sufficiently exalted idea of God in the Sikh scriptures. For reformist intellectuals, ultimate fulfillment of this desire could only be attained by proving that such an idea of God already existed within their own scripture and in its native language. This task was incorporated into the more systematic exegetical commentaries and shorter treatises produced during the mature phase of the Singh Sabha, some 40 or 50 years after its founding. Written by a new generation of scholars, the most influential of these commentaries in modern Punjabi include, Bhaveer Singh's 7-volume, Santhyar Sri Guru Granth Sahib, Teja Singh's 4-volume, Shabad Arth, Sri Guru Granth Sahib, the 10-volume, Sri Guru Granth Darpan by Sahib Singh, and Jodh Singh's single volume, Gurmati Nirnay, Treatise on the Guru's Philosophy. Gurmati Nirnay, published in 1932, was particularly influential, and could be regarded as the first systematic work of Sikh theology. Borrowing from Bhaivir Singh's earlier work, Jodh Singh laid out a new schema for presenting Sikh teachings, one that began with a proof for the existence of God, as a definition of a static immutable one, that is ontologically separate from the world and man. In effect, Jodh Singh had reproduced a Christian schema, not dissimilar to Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, for representing the key ideas of the Sikh gurus in short and easily reproducible form. Gurmati Nirnay packaged the essence of Sikh thought, Gurmat, into a creedal form that provided in native Punjabi, a very succinct access to a schema that could be reproduced with equal facility, by Sikhs writing in Punjabi or English. By doing so, it armed Sikh publicists, literary figures, and preachers, with an accessible creed that could be rapidly deployed to combat other creeds, i.e., Hindu, Muslim and Christian. It provided a way for later generations of Sikh scholars, especially those writing in English, to materialize a Sikh worldview, and on the basis of this worldview, to locate itself within the discourse of world religions. Indeed, it would be safe to suggest that this corpus of reformist publications was instrumental in transforming an amorphous Sikhi into the more concrete, boundaried entity that we call Sikhism today. Once this partly imagined, partly real entity, Sikhism, had come into view, it was possible to reformulate a Sikh code of ethics and conduct. Bodies like the Chief Khalsa Diwan had tried to do this in the early decade of the 20th century, but only got as far as producing a document called Gurmat Prakash Bag Sanskar, in 1915. However, this document was not ratified by the Sikh community until 1951, when the official Sikh Code of Conduct, or Sikh Rahit Maryada, was published. With the publication and ratification of the Sikh Rahit Maryada, the Sikhs finally had a document that spelled out its core beliefs and practices, and outlined its worldview. It represented the culmination of almost 7 decades of work by Singh Sabha scholars.